Hello and welcome to Two Tall Guys Talking Sales. We're your hosts. I'm Kevin.
And I'm Sean.
And we're glad you're here. For the next 15 minutes, we'll talk about a sales issue, big and small, for salespeople, sales leaders, and selling situations. We're glad you're here, and let's get started. Today, we're joined by a special guest, Tom Morgan, and Tom wins the furthest versus the mostest award. He's the furthest away from Cincinnati. He's up in Portland, Maine, and so we're so glad to have Tom here today. But Tom, you were telling us a story off microphone here. Would you dive back into all things that kids do in sports?
It's great to be here. It's great to be here from Maine. Like all of us, successful people in our careers that have children, we all got involved very early on coaching our children in sports. And, you know, the sports that I sort of gravitated to were basketball and lacrosse. Those are my favorites. But like most parents, soccer is what you get your children into at the age of 5. They have all these youth programs and all the parents get their kids in, and that's the first sport you really get exposed to. So I was recruited to coach, obviously. And what I noticed, and it was kind of funny, in our town, the young athletes wore reversible jerseys. One side was black, one side was gold. And so when you were out there doing your scrimmages, you had a yellow team and a black team. And we would throw the ball out, and it basically looked like a swarm of bumblebees. And that's what we used to call it, bumblebee soccer, because all you saw was this black and yellow just chasing the ball all around the field. And the good news was they were 5-year-olds. They got good and sweaty. They worked hard. They had their oranges at halftime. We all went to Dunkin' Donuts. It was New England. We all went to Dunkin' Donuts after the game. But really, as coaches, you realize that this isn't how it's supposed to look. So what you start to do is you start to come up with games and little theories in your weekly practices or before you play on Saturday that kind of teaches that positioning and that spacing. And eventually there's one person who gets it and stands over. So everyone's over here. The ball squirts out. That one person gets the ball, kicks it in the goal, and then everyone starts to realize, oh, wow, we don't have to all be in the same place chasing the ball. And so one by one, you play games every week, and the players start to realize it. And then by about, usually a 13-week season, by about the 13th week, you finally have what was some semblance of a match where people were at least in positioning. But it took a lot of games, it took a lot of fun, it took a lot of practice to get ourselves to that point. And we still laugh about those days, the bumblebee soccer, just watching the swarm of black and yellow just running all over the field.
And Tom, thank you very much for being on. You actually relate this to sales and sales process. Tell us about that.
Sure. So ever since joining Sales Xceleration, I've met with a number of different sales organizations of different companies. And you go in and like as you're meeting them and learning about their business, you ask a lot of questions about their process and sort of how they're playing the game they're in, the business they're in. And very often it comes back like, well, we have a prospect, so our team really starts focusing on what's our prospect list look like, who's calling, let's start making calls, let's start doing things. And then we get our people all the way through to a proposal, then we're all in a room doing proposal. And I would look at them and I'd say, you know what? I mean, the way you guys are describing your sales process reminds me like I'm coaching a bunch of 5-year-olds in soccer. You've got your team all just chasing the one opportunity instead of really being focused and disciplined on how to translate each one of these opportunities. So in a case of prospecting, who's doing the prospecting? Who's going out looking for new customers? And typically a CEO will say, well, that's everybody's job. I'm like, well, if it's everybody's job, then who's doing the backtrack to make sure that you're doing customer service and nurturing those existing clients you have? Well, that's everyone's job. And I'm like, all right, so who's conducting those early discovery meetings to see if there's a good fit with a potential client? Well, that's every one of my sales team's job. And then it comes back to like, all right, this is a youth soccer game. So then we start to transition, just like we did in youth soccer, to everyone knowing what their role is, everyone knowing what the accountabilities are, everyone knowing what they need to do in the process to move the ball down the field, to win the opportunity, to win the game.
That's wonderful. For everybody listening, we have a lot of CEOs, seasoned sales leaders, new salespeople that are looking for some leadership in their chosen profession. And so when you talk about that, we kind of need to name those things. That lack of who's on first and who's playing what position is lack of role clarity. And Tom, that's such a great story that anybody listening to this can relay back to their organization. Hey, we've got this soccer story, this young soccer team, and we've got a lack of role clarity, and it really rears its ugly head in the day in and day out. So when we think about sales and coaching, how are you transitioning these businesses to have more role clarity and process clarity?
Well, it's an interesting question. I'll go back to youth soccer because I had a young player, and he was not really athletic, but the parents signed him up to play youth soccer. And so I was talking to him, like, what are you interested in? He's like, I love math. I'm like, oh. He goes, yeah, I'm going to go to MIT. I'm going to be a mathematician. I love running statistics. I'm like, all right, so if you really love that, I'm going to put you on defense. And he's like, well, why is that? I'm like, well, when a player comes down, if he uses his right foot predominantly, what do you think you should try to do? And he's like, well, mathematically, I should try to get him to use his left foot because he's less, strong with his left foot. I'm like, exactly. So why don't you play the percentages? You'll stand here, play the percentages. You know the angles. If the goal's here and you stand here, there's a 30% difference that person might not be able to kick the ball into the goal. And he absolutely loved it. And true story, he was running for political office about 8 years ago, came to my door, and we just laughed about the story. But it's the same thing in looking at a sales organization, right? You have all these players on the team, and everyone has defined and skill sets, but also has interest. And it really is getting with your team and looking at all the stages in the process, just like all stages of the game, all activities that have to happen in the game. What are all the stages in your sales process? And then lining up your team. Who might be the best fit? If you have somebody like that that's very analytical, perhaps they're better in a back-end role as far as analyzing the sales data and providing the sales team with information to go make decisions. If you have somebody that's really aggressive and that loves to chase the ball down and loves to really be that person out at the forefront, perhaps that's somebody who would be on your hunting team, that would be your prospecting team. So it's really taking each stage of your sales process, just like each stage of a soccer game, and getting the right players into the right roles. So it's kind of like getting your team, getting the right people in the right seats is what we use in business. That's the same thing you do in sports. If somebody's going to, like the story of my defender, if that's what he really wants to do and he's good at and he's passionate about it, you know what? He's going to be successful at it, and he's going to be proud of what he's doing. And so I think for all of our people in our sales organization is finding what they do best, what they're interested in, and getting the right people into the right roles.
Very interesting. So one of the things that I've noticed about small companies, and like Kevin and like you, I worked for much larger companies earlier in my career, the ability to leverage other departments, other people is not nearly as strong in a smaller company where they just don't have the breadth and the depth of bench. How do you get around that issue where they've only got 2 salespeople? They can't really divide up the role, or they've only got 4 salespeople. They can't really divide that up. How do you get around that? How do you deal with that? How do you coach through that process?
That's it's very interesting, Sean. You've got all your activities. You know the things that have to happen in the sales process that for something to be successful. So typically on a small team, what we'll do is we know all the stages. We know clearly what our goals are. And it's really lining up their daily activities and their weekly into their weekly practices to who's focusing on what today. It's one of those things in sports. You'll hear coaches talk that what's important now, what's important today. I think with a small team, and because it's small, maybe you don't think you need to meet enough, but it's really clarifying what the roles are in the process, clarifying all the activities, but really doing those daily stand-up meetings, those weekly scheduled meetings, so that each person was clearly not overlapping. I mean, the use of a CRM, especially with small teams, so that people can have transparency into their actions. Just like on a sports team, you want transparency into what's happening. I think in a small sales team, it's being transparent, but it's those key stand-up meetings. I don't want to overburden people by being in too many sales meetings every week, but those daily stand-up meetings to get clarity on what are we working on, what's important, where are we at in the process. looking at things. And as teams get bigger, you can find out skill sets. And what I've seen is people grow. You may realize that, hey, what we need is help on the back end getting these proposals through. So I think in a small team, the key is identifying where are your roadblocks, where are your obstacles, so that as you grow, you can determine what is the next role. So if it's a team of 2, when you're starting to grow, do you bring on a third person to do the same thing the other 2 are, or do you realize now that we're starting to expand that perhaps there's some help that could be needed in sales operations, or maybe we need someone dedicated totally to hunting and prospecting. So I think it's being aware, but the key is that transparency and those daily stand-ups and really being open and candid about where you're at, and then using your CRM to provide that transparency so you can make clear decisions every day.
Fantastic. So let's pick at that a little bit, because I would imagine there's some leaders out there who are saying, wow, a daily meeting, that is taxing. But I think they probably skipped over the stand-up part of that meeting. So thinking about your daily basketball practice or lacrosse practice or soccer practice, there's always that before practice starts, you're going to meet for a couple of minutes to set the objectives and really chalk the field of sorts. Can you kind of prescriptively give our audience a nugget of how they might implement this type of stand-up meeting daily to get more out of their sales team?
Well, it's really interesting because the stand-up meetings, especially if you're in an office, but even if you're working remotely now, they're happening. They're just not happening with a purpose. Who hasn't been in an office and everyone's hanging around the coffee machine, maybe talking about last night's game, or they're talking about the movie they went to over the weekend? It's really about trying to make that first 15 minutes, first 30 minutes a day have some purpose as well. So it's great to have that socialization, but then pivot that to what are we working on today? What are the important priorities of the day? And what can we do to move things forward today? So it's really taking that social time at the beginning of the day and trying to put some sort of purpose to it and not losing the social aspect of it. But that's what we did in any team I coach, is you always got together. How's everybody feeling? How's everybody doing? What's new at school? What's new in your lives? All right, here's our priorities for this week's practice. We've got this team coming up as an opponent next week. We're going to have to focus more on defense. They're a high-scoring team, so defense is going to be really important. So you don't even take the field until you've kind of explained that. So why wouldn't we do that in work as well? It's great to see everybody. A nice little social time. Let's have our coffee. All right, as we all know, we're at the middle of the quarter right now. It's February. This is the time where if we're going to close the quarter strong, we need to make sure deals are moving at this point, because we want to put too much pressure in the last 2 weeks of the year. So what are each of us working on? So there's little examples you could do that, but it does go back to, like, you never start a sports practice without telling people what the objective of the day is. So why would you do it in business? Why wouldn't you do it in business?
I love relating sports, which is what many salespeople spent some time in their life doing, or at least watching, to real life and what's going to happen. I know you have a basketball background, Tom, but I love basketball. I'm actually a high school basketball official, and I'm thinking about 10 seconds left. We're down by 1 point. Who's going to get the ball? Draw up the play. We practiced the play plenty in practice all week long, every week, all season long. But now we're going to diagram it out again. The coach is going to reinforce it. This person's going to throw the ball in. He's going to throw it over to Jerry, who's going to do a bounce pass over to Larry, and Larry's going to put the ball in the basket, and we're going to win the game. And you're going to set these picks. That last minute, how are we going to do it? End of the quarter, how are we going to get this deal in? Talk about that. But I think we're going to run out of time before you finish your answer. So I'm going to interrupt you probably halfway through your answer and ask you to come back, because we're just short of 15 minutes right now. So give us a little hint, and then I'll stop you. And can you come back next week and join us, and we'll kind of finish out that answer?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I will say, if the first time you're hearing about that play is with 10 seconds left in the game, you weren't prepared and you haven't practiced properly.
I love that. So let's dig into practice. Let's dig into that last minute strategy next week. And so everybody out there in listener land, if you're listening to our podcast, make sure you've subscribed to our podcast so it just comes right on your podcast player. Hit the subscribe button, whatever player you're using. And next week, Tom's going to come back, and we're going to start off with that last minute play, which means the end of the quarter play that's going to get you over the top and make you a lot of commission for the year. Thank you very much, Tom. And everybody, we're looking forward to talking to you again.
Well, same here.
Thank you very much for joining us on this podcast of Two Tall Guys Talking Sales. We hope that we were able to share some valuable insight, valuable knowledge with you to make your selling adventures easier and more successful. Please join us every week. We drop these on Tuesday afternoon at 4:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Please subscribe to us in your favorite podcast player. Also, please join us on LinkedIn, where we do a CEO workshop, and that CEO workshop is dedicated monthly to big questions that CEOs are having and how to grow their business and drive sales. You can find us on LinkedIn. Just search for Two Tall Guys Talking Sales. Thank you very much. Have a great day.